So welcome everybody to this seminar of the IHR British History in the Long 18th Century seminar. In a moment, I'll introduce the speaker, but just before we start, I'll just outline what the format of the session for those who are not familiar with it. We'll start with any notices people have about historical matters. I'll then introduce the speaker and the paper title and hand over to Uri, our speaker tonight, who will speak for around 50 minutes or so. At the end of that, we'll show our appreciation, and then everyone will be given, we'll give everyone a short break of 5-10 minutes for your physical and mental comfort, and to allow you to think about the questions you'd like to ask, and I'll encourage you to put those in the chat so that it's easier to sort of marshal those and see those. When we all reassemble, there'll then be a question and answer session, which Uri has agreed to. So without any more ado, I'm going to start with notices. I had one brief one, which I've already posted in the chat, the link, which is that BSEX are having the first of what they hope will be an annual online conference. So if you're interested in putting in a proposal for that, the deadline is the 30th of June, and you can follow the link there. And I see a hand up from Arthur, who also has a notice. So do you want to unmute Arthur and give us your notice?
So it's just to note that many of you will have seen this, I'm sure, but that James Fisher, late of this parish, in terms of our seminar membership, has just been nominated for the Whitfield Prize for his book on the formation of agricultural knowledge in the 18th century, which is very nice to see, I think. And it was a strong field for the 18th century more generally, as there were two other 18th century books, I think, on the list of 6. So well done to all those.
Yes, that is good news. Is there anybody else? Helen, is that your hand up? Helen, you need to unmute. Helen?
You need to unmute. But
in the absence of the unmuting from Helen, I think we're going to have to move on, but if there is something she wants to ask, perhaps we can slot it in later on. So in that case, I'm going to move on to introduce our speaker for the seminar tonight, Uri Erman, who is a cultural historian of the 18th century with interest in the history of gender, performativity and sociability. And his research focuses on public performers, actors and singers, and their central position in public discourse as lightning rods for the negotiation of social norms and group identity. He's finishing a manuscript titled Opera, Gender and National Identity in Britain, 1760 to 1830, of which we'll hear today, because that's the title of his paper. But his new postdoctoral project examines the power dynamic between actresses and male nobles in 18th century Britain. He's currently a Kreitman Fellow at the History Department of Ben Gurion University in Israel, and next year will be a Fellow at the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He's published an article about Jewish opera singers in the Journal of British Studies, and has a forthcoming article from his project on actresses and nobles in 18th century studies. So without any more ado, I'm going to turn my video off and give your eyes all a break and hand over to Uri.
Thank you so much, Gillian. Thank you for the conveners of the seminar. Thank you for everyone of you for being here. I'm very, very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to share my work with you. I'll dive right in. According to a widely held view in the mid-18th century, Britons were somehow inherently unmusical, and this supposed shortcoming was, in fact, a virtue. In 1762, the dramatist George Colman expounded on this view in his satirical afterpiece, The Musical Lady, which revolves around a musically crazed young lady who is eventually forced to acknowledge her lack of real musicality and give herself entirely to her husband's redeeming masculine guidance. The lesson to be learned was then explicated in the epilogue. Quote, "Now for the moral, ye that love to roam, for taste abroad, learn common sense at home. For arts and arms, a Briton is the thing. John Bull was made to roar, but not to sing." The Musical Lady debuted on the background of the 7 Years' War. During this period, Britons grew to consider their nation as military, expansionist, and endeavoring. The imperial project of the period reinforced the long-standing British suspicion of continental influence and foreign luxuries, including the Italian opera. This art form was imported into Britain in the early 18th century, but immediately triggered an intense populist backlash that presented it as a degenerate and artificial medium associated with Catholic and absolutist Europe. The threat of opera lay first and foremost with its singers, who were perceived as distorting language and common sense, as making a scandalous use of their bodies, and as corrupting society from their privileged position within it. All of these attributes supposedly revealed the singer's false essence, thus frustrating opera's claim to higher truths. This anti-operatic discourse articulated its objections to the medium along class and national lines, and emphasized the supposed unique characteristics of the British nation, which opera seemed to corrode. These characteristics are moderation, regularity, steadiness, practicality, sincerity, plainness, sound empiricism, and obviously good old common sense. All of these qualities were championed as manifesting the superiority of Britain over other nations in a ubiquitous chauvinistic discourse. Thus, the musical lady and its epilogue expressed some of the most prevalent ideas about Italian opera in the British public sphere: its identification as a form of luxury, its association with feminine caprice, its opposition to essential British qualities, and the perceived threat it posed to the British state. The effeminacy and artificiality of Italian opera was most perfectly manifested in its leading male protagonists, the castrati, whose unmatched expressivity and virtuosity only served to echo the unspeakable violence inflicted upon them. However, there was another context to the musical lady. The previous month saw the debut of Artaxerxes, the first English language opera to be fully modeled on the Italian operatic formula, including the use of castrati. The composer, Thomas Arne, consciously attempted to prove the feasibility of Italian-style opera in English, and thus to show that Britons perhaps could both roar and sing. This was a bold attempt to offer British audiences a vision of themselves as a singing nation, and Artaxerxes went on to enjoy a solid and enduring success. Artaxerxes' real importance lies, however, in that it marked a new period in British musical life. Changes in cultural sensibilities during this period opened up new possibilities for the operatic medium to shed its aristocratic and cosmopolitan associations and emerge as a vehicle for the national sentiment. These developments were manifested in the rising genre of English language opera and in the emergence of a new generation of British singers who were to perform it. In this respect, the musical lady was an early response to a gradually transforming cultural landscape. My book project analyzes the emerging dynamic between a mutating cultural form that seeks approval and an insistent attitude that attempts to redraw cultural borders and combat what it perceives as cultural contagion. The book's main chapters follow three groups of singers: high-pitched men, virtuosic prima donnas, and Jews, all of which exhibited in different ways opera's reliance on alterity, on otherworldliness, on effect. As they strove to break new ground for opera in Britain, these singers were perceived as stretching the limits of vocal and social propriety. These exchanges reveal the act of singing as a central issue of identity, linking every Briton's personal conduct with questions of high politics and the nation's standing. This is the central theme of my book, the question of whether Britons could sing, and how this question was negotiated in the public discourse in relation to an emergent generation of British opera singers. Today, I will focus on one aspect of these dynamics, the attempts to reconfigure men's relation to singing, particularly through what I call the high-pitched man. I will dedicate a few sentences at the end to show how it fits into my larger argument. But first, a few general remarks about opera. From its beginning at the turn of the 17th century, opera was designed as a powerful spectacle that aims to engross its listeners in a deeply emotional and aesthetic experience, overcoming their tendency to view the world at a safe distance. The singers hold the central position in this exchange. They are embodying the medium's musicality. They are full of it as it pulsates within them and engulfs all those who listen to them. As audiences found themselves in close proximity to the singer's body, they were driven to contemplate its ontology and social implications in ways that were rarely called for in other media. These general features had a political dimension. During the 18th century, opera seria, the serious and noble genre of Italian opera, focused on the dramatization of classical myths and ancient histories, and used these settings to offer its audiences a thinly veiled allegory of absolutist power. The castrati were the linchpin of this representational scheme. The main symbolic function of their voice was to serve as proxy for the prince who patronized it, lending him, as opera scholar Martha Feldman had put it, their affective and technological powers. Feldman stresses their extreme virtuosity in this respect, operating within an old regime logic of spectacle and enchantment. As I've already mentioned, the introduction of Italian opera into Britain had a profound molding effect on the cultural landscape. Not only did it give rise to the all-pervasive anti-operatic discourse, it also galvanized the English musical sphere itself. First, by the emergence of ballad opera, a genre explicitly developed in contradistinction to Italian opera. This genre's reliance on borrowed music, its jovial atmosphere, and its emphasis on musical insincerity all help to keep audiences at a healthy, ironic distance from musical effect. On the other hand, the nation's high-end artistic resources were directed in a different direction, toward oratorio. This genre is highly informed by operatic conventions, but with its simpler vocal addresses set to English texts and within a devotional frame of reference, it was wholeheartedly adopted as a defining element of British identity. As Handel's oratorios were gradually established as the canonic musical expression of national identity, they further undercut any attempts to offer a competing secular genre of English language opera. Thus, throughout the first half of the 18th century, we find two operatic traditions characterized by a different vocal palette, a different attitude towards vocal sonority and virtuosity, and a different understanding of the symbolic function of dramatic singing itself. This bifurcation of the musical scene was the obstacle that Arne was trying to overcome. It's a surprising fact, and one in need of explanation, that Arne's adaptation of the Italian formula retained the castrato, the most disparaged element of this formula. How can we account for that? Scholars tend to dismiss this attempt as a one-off, as an attempt by Arne to prove the feasibility of writing such an opera in English, with the castrato depicted as a sort of a burden that ultimately hindered the opera's reception. From this perspective, Artaxerxes and its English language castrato seem to be an anomaly in the annals of British musical culture. However, I argue that Arne's use of a castrato is at the center of his attempt to inculcate Britons to opera. My main argument will be that this opera and its use of castrati attempted to confront a major obstacle in the British cultural sphere, men's vexed relation to the act of singing and to musical affectivity in general. I will now just share my presentation. Just a second. Okay, I hope you now can see, you can all see my presentation. So about men's vexed relation to the act of singing and to musical affectivity, already John Locke, in his 1693 treatise, Thoughts Concerning Education, had written, and I have it here, I have amongst men of parts and business so seldom heard anyone commended or esteemed for having an excellency in music, that amongst all those things that ever came into the list of accomplishments, I think I may give it the last place. Moralists and conduct book writers echoed this ideological stance throughout the 18th century. I will only mention in this context the work of Richard Leppert, who has shown this wonderfully in a full-length book. This stance is at the root of Colman's admonition for Britons to keep roaring but not to sing. Arne's endeavor, on the other hand, was informed by three concurrent developments. First, attitudes towards opera began to change around mid-century. There was a growing recognition of the medium's artistic merits and a growing need to adapt it into the vernacular, as was happening elsewhere in Europe. The second development Arne relied on was the dominance of the social agenda of refinement. The refinement of initially men's behavior, the control of their temperament, restraint, politeness, but increasingly refinement in terms as it was related to the culture of sensibility, the search for feeling men who internalize sensibilities, modes of emotional atomization and articulation. The importance of music to this cultural agenda was widely acknowledged. In the first volume of his general history of music, Charles Burney extolled and I have here the quote, extolled the effects of ancient music in softening the manners, promoting civilization and humanizing men. And he urged modern composers to follow the ancients' footsteps. In this context, the voice of the castrato could serve a profound representational function. Outlandish as he was, the castrato was made, literally made, for the act of singing, for its softening of language, for its sensuality, and for what was perceived as its essential femininity. In his person, Italian opera seria found the perfect fusion of the ethereal and the resonant, the pathetic and the heroic, needed for the persuasive portrayal of heroic male figures in song. This construal was intuitively grasped by John Dennis, one of the earliest proponents of the anti-operatic stance. In his essay upon public spirit, he asserted that a musical voice is natural only to some species of birds, but always accidental to men, for which reason a cock-nightingale sings better than Niccolini, castrato, nay, or than Siface himself could, without being taught or without being gelt for that matter. And there is a better opera in a Kentish grove in the month of April than ever there was at Rome, at Naples, or at Venice. So according to Dennis, singing is not natural to man, but belongs more properly to the domain of nature. Any man who ventures into song beyond accidental occurrences, especially in such an extravagant manner as castrati, only reveals his own gelding, castration. In this respect, the high pitch of the castrati manifests their emancipation from the confines of manly, i.e. rational and speech-based modes of communication. Now, Dennis viewed this emancipation with abhorrence, but Arne, 50 years later, attempted to appropriate it. His ability to appropriate it relied on a third development, a reformist agenda within the opera world itself that, among other things, reconfigured the castrato's voice. These reformers tried to make opera more humane, more enlightened. They tinkered with its dramatic structures and made use of new musical styles, such as the gallant style, that basically emphasizes melody over harmony. In this context, the virtuosic castrati of earlier decades gave way to what Martha Feldman calls the new Orphic model of castrati, whose singing was characterized by a limited range, expressive use of dynamics and timbres, and a clear and touching melody. All these strands came to bear on Arne's production. On the one hand, he relied on the traditional opera seria formula, linking the high-pitched man with elevated noble heroes. On the other hand, the high-pitched voice was associated not with technical virtuosity, but with lyrical Orphic lines, expressive and sentimental. Let us hear an excerpt from Artaxerxes. At the beginning of the third act, Arbaces, the hero, is forced to escape the city due to political intrigue. And at this point, he sings the undoubted hit of the opera, Water Parted from the Sea. Before setting off into the unknown, Arbaces pauses to contemplate the experience of exile in a simile aria that compares his situation to that of rolling waters. So he's going into exile, and he's going to roll like water rolling on land. We'll listen to this lovely 2-minute aria, and I would only ask you to try and find, to see if you can hear where the emotional climax of the aria occurs. What words sort of receive a special treatment? It's quite mild. It's not extremely dramatic, but it's there. So I'll just share the sound of my computer, so you will be able to hear it clearly. Okay. So here's the aria, obviously performed not by a castrato, but by a woman, a contralto. And I also have here for you the text of the aria. So enjoy. Okay, I think we'll pause here. This aria is set as an F major minuet, the stately, fashionable dance of the period. And it conveys Arbaces' noble character, his composure in the face of adversity, and his confidence in his ultimate return. It expresses this dignity with a certain lightness, typical of the contemporary gallant style, through the dotted rhythm and the quivering trills. The river's flow is suggested by the rich orchestral texture and the stretching gesture of the violins. With no elaborate vocal ornamentations or cadenzas, it is delivered in a direct, mostly syllabic manner, giving it almost a balladic feel. As to the emotional climax, I hope you heard it, it is the words, "Still it murmurs as it flows," that receive special treatment. By the analogy of the simile, the murmuring sound of the water as it flows is Arbaces' own singing. This is a reflexive gesture, which, marked by a sort of a longing dual rise to a higher pitch to F, serves as the emotional climax of the aria, a climax which, however, is well contained within the relatively limited range of the melody. Thus, while the text maintains a rather stoic outlook, it is the music that not only conveys Arbaces' emotional struggle, but legitimizes the validity of expressing it musically. He will murmur in song until he returns home. Arbaces draws our attention to his singing, claiming it as a natural expression of this type of sentimental male hero as he sets out into the unknown world. So there is a very interesting negotiation of masculinity in song here. Orphic singing, sentimental, poignant, yet restrained, stoic in its outlook of the hero's unfolding tragic circumstances. For these reasons, the aria became not only a major hit, but the musical calling card of the high-pitched man. Unsurprisingly, the castrato who created the role of Arbaces, Giusto Fernando Tenducci, chose to exhibit a copy of this aria in his engraved portrait of 1717. You can see it here. Arne's endeavor then was not a belated and doomed attempt to adopt the traditional Italian formula wholesale, but a pioneering attempt to break new expressive ground for male singers in English language opera. This attempt came on the heels of a broader campaign to reform the notion of masculinity at the time, in which the possibility of male expressive singing became emblematic of male sensibility at large. The London audiences greeted Artaxerxes with favor. The opera averaged 10 performances every season for the following 4 seasons. This is a steady rather than a spectacular success. However, this success was lasting. Artaxerxes remained in the repertoire for more than 70 years. Of all the arias in the opera, Water Parted struck a particular chord with listeners. The literary critic Leigh Hunt tried to articulate its unique effect, writing, "Arne's air of Water Parted winds about the feelings with an earnest and graceful tenderness of regret, worthy in the highest degree of the affecting beauty of the sentiment." A certain equilibrium is at play here. The aria winds about the feelings, but never wallows in them, its tenderness always retaining a sense of grace and earnestness. Such a construct could find an effective path even to the most resistant listener. In one of his first Elia essays, Charles Lamb proclaimed that he has no ear for music, but immediately added a qualification. To say that this heart never melted at the concourse of sweet sounds would be a foul self-libel. Water Parted from the Sea never fails to move it strangely. Strangely moving the hearts of men was, perhaps, the aria's intended effect. Hunt and Lamb were of the second generation of Artaxerxes' listeners, but the aria's earnest and graceful tenderness of regret was recognized early on as related to the quest to refine men. In his 1773 play, She Stoops to Conquer, Oliver Goldsmith has one of the hero's friends proclaim his love for Water Parted as a sign of his gentlemanly persona, calling it the very genteelest of tunes. In another example, a satirical newspaper column titled Mr. Bachelor, a young lady is presented as seeking Mr. Bachelor's advice regarding her 2 suitors. Writing, "Mr. Myrtle has fine black eyes. He dances delightfully and sings and plays the fiddle like an angel. Indeed, he sings Water Parted from the Sea as well as Tanducci. Logic has better teeth and dances too, but not well. Nor does he make a bow like Mr. Myrtle. But they say he is a great scholar. I wish you were to hear Mr. Myrtle sing. Mr. Logic can't sing at all. Your humble servant, Kitty Catgut." The binary of sound and sense is manifested in Myrtle, named after the plant of the goddess Venus, and Logic. Myrtle is distinguished by his refined performative gestures, bowing, dancing, and above all, singing Water Parted. Although Logic adopts some of these gestures as prevailing manners dictated, he does so not well, revealing that he has not lost his substantive and scholarly essence. Of all the suitors' attributes, their singing best betrays their respective qualities. The one sings as well as Tanducci, while the other can't sing at all. The singing of Water Parted becomes an emblem of the new refined male, who models his expressivity on that of the castrato in an appeal to the frenzied and over-sentimental Kitty Catguts of the nation. The relation of singing to refinement arises from the combination of the musical style and the vocal register. Cantabile, singable line sung by a high-pitched castrato. The perceived femininity of the high voice was stylized in cantabile phrases, but was kept within masculine confines by proclaiming its sober and restrained negotiation of emotion. As I argued earlier, at the heart of this construct lay the conflicted relation of men to the act of singing. One newspaper criticizing Tenducci raised this issue to the surface. Rousseau affirms that singing does not appear natural to man. For though the savages of America sing because they talk, yet the true savage never sings. Ergo, castration was invented, and Tenducci is to be a fresh wonder. Heavens preserve any man from such natural notes. Selectively quoting from Rousseau's Dictionary of Music, the writer raises an important question: is singing natural to man? Here, man is understood as the male who stands for humanity. The woman is completely glossed over, as if in the primal stage of their history, all humans were manly. The mark of manliness is its avoidance of song. Tenducci's castration is the conscious manipulation that allows men to transgress their masculinity and sing in what, according to the writer, is a decidedly unnatural and contra-Rousseauian act. The above reactions already suggest that successful as Artaxerxes was, its attempt to model male refinement on the castrato's voice was highly objectionable. Shortly after the debut of Artaxerxes, an essay in the Theatrical Review forcefully articulated this objection. Some very great patriots imported the Italian opera from the generous motive, as they say, of relaxing our ferocity and softening the savageness of our manners. And when we consider that Britons were brought to admire their absurdities of stabbing and fighting and praying and laughing and crying and dying, and all to music, we must do them the justice to acknowledge that they did relax us with a vengeance. The writer explicitly evokes the vocabulary of the ideology of refinement, the relaxing of British ferocity and the softening of its manners, only to unmask it as a double-edged sword that actually spells male degeneration. Such a public mood boded ill for a deeper engagement with the castrato. Later attempts in 1764 and 65 to mount an all-sung English opera with a castrato all proved complete failures. Artaxerxes proved to be a dead end for English opera, at least in terms of genre, opera seria, and the casting of castrati. However, in broader terms of vocal technique and vocal composition, Artaxerxes was a watershed event in the history of English opera. As Charles Burney himself put it, it is not difficult to fix the area of change in our vocal music, which seems to have remained stationary for near half a century. It was begun by the compositions and instructions of Dr. Arne, who endeavored to refine our melody and singing more from Italian than English models. Tenducci's performance in Artaxerxes had a rapid effect upon the public taste and stimulated to imitation all that were possessed of good ears and flexible voices. Obviously, Burney's main contention is that the imitation of Tenducci was primarily in terms of vocal technique, creating the search for a sound, well-developed operatic technique. However, I argue that the imitation of the castrato's voice took another, more direct form in the following decades. The very possibility of having a high-pitched man in English operas was now entertained through an imitation of sorts, through the use of falsetto. Now, falsetto as a technique involves the limited vibrations of the vocal folds that allows singers to extend their range by about an octave. Why should the reception of the falsetto be any different than that of the castrato? Well, first, because there was already a history to falsetto singing in England, an established tradition rooted in 17th century court culture. However, the coming of the castrato in the early 18th century tainted such voices by association, and the falsetto disappeared from theatrical settings, was marginalized mainly to church settings, the chapel royal, etc. This was part of the bifurcation of the musical sphere that I mentioned. However, now the return to falsetto could be framed as a return to an established tradition. Secondly, and more importantly, the ontology of falsetto singing, as listeners construed it, was entirely different. This was a voice born of choice, of technique, perhaps born of manipulation. We'll see references to this later. But it was decidedly not born of continental violence and all of the associations that always come with the castrato of absolutist and Catholic Europe. In the next 3 decades, we find the falsetto established as the most fashionable form of singing. This transformation, coming on the heels of Tenducci's performances, was due mainly to 2 singers, George Mattox and Michael Leone. You have them here in the pictures. Mattox was a leading Covent Garden tenor who played an important part in the operatic experiments of the era. He had a minor role in Artaxerxes, for example. Although a tenor in essence, Mattox increasingly ventured into the falsetto range, presumably inspired by the success of his colleague Tenducci. In 1763, a satirical poem attacked Mattox, referring to him as, quote, Miss Molly Mattox, who walks in a soft, affected pace. This is an allusion to the Mollies of London's homosexual subculture. The poem then brutally attacked Mattox's singing. Oops, sorry. Quavering and straining out of tune and rule, like shock when squeezing of his matin stool, turned as he walked and cursed his iron fate, wishing castration and Peretti's state. The effort of producing a falsetto voice is analogous to a shock, a fashionable lapdog squeezing a morning stool. From this already emasculating position, Mattox can only wish he was castrated like Peretti, another castrato. The extent and deployment of Mattox's falsetto are difficult to gauge, yet the relative proximity of his singing to the Italianate style was apparently hard to miss. As one commentator noted, quote, we are led to imagine that we are listening to a castrato than to an English singer, end quote. Still, Mattox's singing was highly praised by contemporaries who agreed his voice, as one critic put it, was clear, soft, melodious, and expressive, qualities which in conjunction constituted the new refined model of male singing. Hugh Kelly, writer of an influential poem on contemporary performers, defined Mattox's elusive effect. His tender strain, so delicately clear, steals ever honeyed on the heaviest ear. The new ideal type of the refined male here received a full embodiment, capable of inciting allurement and charm, but without imposing. Importantly, Kelly later references a specific operatic role Mattox had created, young Meadows in Love in a Village. This opera was another Arne success. It was composed by Arne also in 1762, that marked the beginning of an English tradition of comic opera. Meadows is the quintessential refined gentleman, and he exhibits this quality through his consistently high placement of the voice, taking him through what were probably extended phrases of falsetto singing. If Mattox presented only an extended falsetto range, a more revolutionary figure was Michael Leone, who sang primarily in falsetto, what today we would call a countertenor. Leone was a Jew who was discovered singing in the Ashkenazi synagogue in London during the early 1770s. His reception as a Jew was a subject of an article that I published a few years ago in Journal of British Studies, and you have the reference here. Here, however, I will limit myself to some remarks on his novelty as a falsettist. After his discovery at the synagogue, Leone was introduced to London audiences as Arbaces in Artaxerxes. By this, Leone inherited the role from Tenducci, establishing a lineage between the castrato and falsetto voices. The anticipation towards Leone's debut highlighted this lineage. It is the general opinion of the critics and connoisseurs that he will far surpass even Signor Tenducci, who has hitherto stood without a rival in that character. Leone's success was also assessed in relation to this lineage. Leone was singing in a manner sufficient to create jealousy and envy in the breasts of some of the most celebrated castrati. This is one of the newspapers. Leone went on to enjoy considerable success for more than a decade. Most importantly, his falsetto was introduced into English language comic operas. He created a leading role in what became the most successful theatrical piece of the 18th century up to that point, Richard Brinsley Sheridan's The Duenna of 1775. This preliminary attempt to sensitize British audiences to the high-pitched man proved a sensational success, and Leone was marked as the opera's prime attraction. By the end of the century, Leone was acknowledged as having made the most significant contribution to the establishment of falsetto singing in Britain. Indeed, we know of singers who tried to imitate Leone in this regard, such as the bass Frederick Charles Reynold. The composer Charles Dibdin rebuked Reynold for his attempt to imitate Leone. Taking the road in which so many singers have been bewildered, leaving the manly part of his singing for the less natural qualifications of modulating through all the meanders of falsetto, Reynold injured his reputation. While lamenting the adoption of the falsetto as adverse to proper manhood, Dibdin testifies to its popularity. The evidence surveyed thus far suggests that from the 1760s onward, falsetto singing became a widespread and fashionable vocal technique. In the 1785 comic opera, The Strangers at Home, one of the characters initiates a comic drinking song indicative of contemporary attitudes. Let first-rate singers stretch their throats in fine falsetto squeaking, with new and strange, unnatural notes, applause from fashion-seeking. The blockhead connoisseurs among, even let them trill and squall, sir. Give me, my boys, a jolly song that ends with Tol de Rolol, sir. The falsetto is described here as a fine singing mode, appealing to the fashionable connoisseurs. It is produced, however, by a stretching of the throat, a reference to its forced mode of production, and is characterized by new, strange, and unnatural notes. The falsetto is diagnosed as an affected deviation from the natural mode of manly singing, which is here on display by the clubbable boys and their jolly, nonsensical refrains. Thus, these two modes of singing connoted a variety of cultural divides, high and low, cultivated and popular, foreign and native, perhaps even Jewish and Christian, which marked the contested battleground of contemporary masculinity in its relation to song. As with the castrato, these reactions already suggest that the falsetto had a checkered reception. The fashionability of the falsetto was marred by a rising discourse which pointed out its supposed corruptions. These were closely associated with those of the castrati, but different. The eminent philosopher James Beattie pinpointed different issues with each of these voice types. A commonsensical philosopher, Beattie adhered to the standard of the natural as a prerequisite in all contexts of art. This view was expressed with urgency when, in a 1776 essay, he addressed the issue of the castrati. May it not be affirmed with truth that no person of uncorrupted taste ever heard for the first time the music I allude to without some degree of horror, proceeding not only from the disagreeable ideas suggested by what was before his eyes, but also from the thrilling sharpness of tone and that startled his ear. Nothing that shocks humanity ought to have a place in human art, nor can a good ear be gratified with unnatural sound. Beattie marks the castrato voice as inherently unnatural. The castrati's unnaturalness is framed from without by the very memory of the act of castration, but also emanates from within with the shrillness and sharpness of their voices. For Beattie, such a unity of etiology and effect is the ultimate testimony to the castrati's perverted nature. A few years later, Beattie's experience of Leone's singing produced a response similar in tone that, however, pinpointed a different problem. In his 1781 letter to the Duchess of Gordon, Beatty wrote, "I was shocked at Leone. A man singing with a woman's voice sounds as unnatural to me as a woman singing with a man's. Either may do in a private company where it is enough if people are diverted, but on stage where nature ought to be imitated, both are, in my opinion, intolerable." Theatrical mimesis has the educational function of denoting the natural through proper imitation. In choosing to sing in falsetto, Leone is perverting the audience's concept of what is natural, announcing in public that all men are in fact capable of falsating themselves into castrati. The unnaturalness of the singing is no longer the product of a separate third species, but of a willful act of imitation over and above gender lines. Although both voices are shocking for Beatty, Leone's falsetto seems to pose a more significant threat, as it paves the way for the habitual perversion of natural gender categories. The falsetto easily maps onto such conceptions, for as its name declares, it was always prone to accusations of inherent falseness. Characterized by a breathy, flute-like timbre and creating almost no overtones, the dry sound of the falsetto was often perceived as manufactured, a voice born of laryngeal manipulation. To sing in falsetto was to sing falsely. Such an anxious stance towards Leone's falsetto voice was pervasive and sometimes produced extreme reactions. I give you one example. The duenna has been a favorite entertainment with that enervated and sentimental part of the public who die at soft notes, though squeezed out of such a wretched machine as Leone. That man is a burlesque on all character, expression, and taste. And yet, by producing a merely sensual effect on the lax nerves of our depraved audiences, he has been the means of giving the duenna a run which no English opera has had since the days of Gay. That's John Gay. We are sorry to observe that our countrymen are gradually losing their taste for manly and rational entertainments. In a torrent of adjectives, Leone's singing is reduced to a physical and sensual effect, operating on the nerves of an already desensitized audience. His vocalization is admittedly soft and alluring, but this only serves to hide what is really a grotesque squeezing machine. The writer has no tolerance for Leone's seduction. His artificiality must be exposed and rejected for manliness to be restored. As Leone's career progressed, this attitude became more pronounced. By the 1780s, the falsetto increasingly fell from grace. A new regime of vocal categories was beginning to form, giving precedence to sopranos and tenors in a strive towards clear, well-defined, and relatable individual identities. This was a specific manifestation of a much larger cultural shift, one that Dror Wouwman has traced in his book, The Making of the Modern Self. Gender ambiguity, as an emblem of what Wouwman calls the ancien regime of identity, increasingly became an anathema. British men who sang in falsetto found themselves entangled in the contemporary vicissitudes of the category of masculinity. In striving toward a refined mode of singing, the falsetto was employed in direct association with the Orphic model of castrati, which was meant to imbue male singing with new expressiveness. However, it proved to be an association of great power, rich with connotations that could not be sifted or easily shaken off. These connotations of effeminacy and its attendant social malaises were not only a matter of the sonority of the high pitch, but found their moral hinge in the very willfulness of the act of falsetto singing. Within this cultural climate, the model of the high-pitched man started to come apart at its already patchy seams. These dynamics would manifest in the casting of the role of arbaces, which was increasingly portrayed by sopranos and eventually by tenors. The demand to purge Artaxerxes of its foreign influences played an increasing role in its future reception. In 1783, when a new production of Artaxerxes exhibited the soprano Signora Sestini in the role of Arbaces, the problem was not her sex, but her nationality. The world will hardly be disposed to commend the good sense of obtruding an Italian voice on an English opera. Are we become so very much refined as to wish to part with our characteristic music? Are the fine, full tones, the sensible sounds, and the expressive energy of an English voice become so disgusting to our ears that we wish to Italianize it? In the name of common sense, let our theaters be distinct. Let us preserve the English character in our music, as well as in our hearts, and be tenacious of everything that serves to distinguish us as a people. Artaxerxes is reclaimed as a purely British piece in a move that fails to mention that the role of Arbaces was created by an Italian, and a castrato at that. From an opera that explicitly attempted to mix the musical traditions, Artaxerxes became a national vehicle, which now must be purged of any non-native voices. From a vehicle for the refinement of British male vocality, it becomes a vehicle for its ossification. In this critique, we can see an emblematic step in the process of erasing the high-pitched man from the annals of English language musical theater. To conclude, Artaxerxes succeeded not only as a popular implementation of the Italian formula, but in asserting this formula's most disparaged element, the high-pitched man, as a representational scheme that might break a path for men towards refined musical sensibility. The fact that the high-pitched man made considerable inroads into the British musical sphere testifies to a somewhat receptive cultural climate. The question of opera and its singers was no longer posed solely from without, as an external threat to a nucleus identity, but was internalized and grappled with from within. Artaxerxes might have been an anomaly, and the dominant attitude in Britain towards the castrati certainly was hostile. But I would argue that Arne's endeavor instigated a committed preoccupation with the high-pitched man that, while never receiving broad cultural assent, nonetheless offered an alternative and created viable cultural products. This episode exemplifies the increased inroads operatic culture made into the British cultural sphere, blurring previous distinctions. It transferred the anti-operatic prism from its usual focus on the cultural border to the cultural home. The fact that this happened with the castrato is particularly important. The emblem of operatic degeneracy here appears as a champion of progressive social and artistic agendas, although a very troubling and contradictory champion, as we saw. In all these respects, the blurring of cultural borders, the internalization of the anti-operatic tension, and the attempts to directly engage with singers' attributes, this episode highlights the main features of my entire project. However, the fact that this representational scheme ultimately failed not only points to the continued tenacity of anti-operatic precepts, but also to how these precepts found themselves in cultural lockstep with the new terrain of gender rigidity. Thus, the ultimate failure of the high-pitched man left the problem of the effeminization of men on the operatic stage as a constant obstacle to the adoption of opera in Britain. Ultimately, these attempts to adopt opera as a national vehicle over a period of several decades only helped to galvanize a guarded attitude towards music, an attitude that Britons were forced to admit was essential to their national identity. Thank you very much.